This week on Act Out, a teacher's strike that's not about pay raises, but instead about almost everything else. Next up, how schools are publicly shaming poor kids because they can't be bothered to cut corporate welfare. Finally, it's a power struggle, but when we fight, we win. Film director Robbie Leppzer joins us to discuss his latest film and how grassroots activism beat back the nuclear power industry. From tweets to marching in the streets, this is Act Out.
Rockets! Blockade! Bulldozers swarm outside the checkpoint gate. A noise flash broke the hush and blew me into the street. I awoke next to the body of my baby. No!
Welcome to Act Out. I'm Eleanor Goldfield, and this is your tipping point. So, last Wednesday, tens of thousands of teachers across Oregon went on strike. Their list of demands included smaller class sizes, a request echoed by teacher strikes across the nation, restored music, arts, PE, and CTE programs, and more teachers, school counselors, nurses, librarians, and support professionals. No doubt it came as a shock to many that their list of demands did not include an increase in salary. That's not to say that they don't deserve one, or that those going on strike for fair wages shouldn't highlight their own economic exploitation. Rather, it's more indicative of how absolutely abhorrent our education system is. That you have to have teachers go on strike for the sake of your own damn children, not even mentioning their own pay. Indeed, one woman's sign simply read, "All we want is what they deserve." Of course, the rich aren't the ones whose kids are suffering. As with any other issue, this latest strike highlights the inequality that's inherent in all of our struggles, from climate justice to racial justice. Cindy Bradley Cross, a teacher at a Portland elementary school, told media, quote, "We could do so much more if we had lower class sizes and mental health supports. But with 32 students, including 7 with high needs and trauma backgrounds, I can't do everything I want for them." Her comments pointedly touch on another inevitability of our failing system. Kids are struggling mentally, emotionally, and physically before they even get into the classroom. They're living in poverty, which studies have shown have direct negative biological effects over time. In a November 2018 Scientific American article on the subject, Robert Sapolsky outlines several ways in which inequality inflicts damage on bodies and brains, noting that this is particularly concerning for developing bodies and minds, i.e. children. Lower socioeconomic status in kindergartners typically have elevated glucocorticoid levels, a thinner and less active prefrontal cortex, and poor prefrontal cortex-dependent impulse control and executive function, i.e. decision-making. These effects increase as kids get older. By adolescence, lower socioeconomic status predicts smaller prefrontal cortex volume. By adulthood, lower socioeconomic status predicts steeper temporally discounted decisions. What all that means is that growing up poor stunts your brain's decision-making and processing skills. Yet another way to grotesquely punish the losers of the birth lottery. As Sapolsky notes, it is outrageous that if children are born into the wrong family, they'll be predisposed toward poor health by the time they start to learn the alphabet. It shouldn't require us to measure inflammation or the length of chromosomes to prove this is wrong. Indeed, it really shouldn't. Which is why the first-hand accounts and experiences of teachers who see the manifestations of this science are so vital. They are the real-world actors bringing life to this scientific script. They are taking stats and delivering them to us in a powerful warning of the dystopian future that we're creating. Because again, these strikes, by highlighting student health and opportunity, highlight the many ways that we fail children outside of school. Kids are living in food deserts and going hungry. They're losing parents or family members to the opioid epidemic, the drug war, job cuts, wage theft, and housing insecurity. They're breathing poisonous air, drinking poisoned water that affects their mental capabilities just as much as their physical. In short, we are building a new generation of ill-educated, sick, and disillusioned humans that are going to have to face the greatest obstacle of all, climate change. We're raising them to believe that capital is king, above even the human right of food. In Warwick, Rhode Island, officials have decided that any children with unpaid lunch debt will be given a plain sunflower seed butter and jelly sandwich, which, first of all, what the fuck is sunflower seed butter? And secondly, are you serious? It's just outrageous that children should even have to pay for school lunches. When I was in school in Sweden, no one checked your family finances before you got a damn tasty and hot meal. And even though I don't eat it anymore, you really shouldn't knock blood pudding with lingonberries until you've tried it. But that aside, what better way to show kids their worthlessness than to hand them a cold, depressing mystery butter sandwich, while their more financially stable counterparts get to choose between pizza and chicken and veggies? Granted, you could certainly make the argument that even the kids who have the choice of food are in a tight competition with prisoners for most gag-worthy lunch. I mean, what the hell is that? 5 mystery meat nuggets, some sugar cookies, and what looks like condensed snot soup? Still, while run-of-the-mill school lunches in this country certainly leave much to be desired, the absolutely wrong direction to go is to threaten kids with even worse food if they don't prove their family's financial worthiness. The school district claims it's owed back pay on meals worth tens of thousands of dollars, and that's on top of a budget deficit in the millions. So really, they have no choice. Yeah, poor you. You have no choice but to publicly shame children for finances that they have no control over, threatening their mental and physical health, essentially using them to blackmail parents into paying what they might not have the ability to pay either. Meanwhile, according to a Good Jobs First subsidy tracker, between 2011 and 2018, Rhode Island gave out $527,643,318 worth of corporate subsidies. I'll say that again. 7 years, Rhode Island awarded corporations $527,643,318 worth of free money. Would anyone like to hazard a guess as to whether or not the Bank of America CEO is eating jelly sandwiches for lunch? My guess is a fraction of that corporate welfare could pay not only to skip publicly shaming poor kids, but give all children in Rhode Island meals that look less like they've been shit out by a champion hot dog eater. The fundamental fact of the matter is, from Rhode Island to Oregon, from Louisiana to Washington state, we are condemning our future. Kids, like adults, are not immune, indeed more susceptible to the ills that we continue to spew, literally and figuratively. Before they even get to school, they're forced to reckon with our systemic dumb shittedness, our bad decisions, from the air they breathe to where they sleep, if they even have a home. And this isn't me trying to be a all-over downer. This is me connecting issues and drawing those lines so that we see how every issue we fight for or against has ripple effects. And therefore, we have to recognize the larger context and stand strongly and loudly in support of strikes like the one in Oregon last week, that not only highlight our future, but the ramifications of today's reality, from public health to economics. Now, shifting from all that's wrong to what's right, the recently released film Power Struggle details the successful grassroots fight against a nuclear power plant in Vermont. Filmed over 5 years, the film shows the power of corporate deception, of captured regulatory bodies, and how people power can and will win, if we choose to stay vigilant and not give up. The Vermont Yankee power plant had been operational since the 1970s and was up for a 40-year renewal. This despite several safety missteps and dangerously aging equipment. The explosion and disaster at the Fukushima Daiichi plant in Japan in 2011 only spotlit the need to shut down Vermont Yankee, which was built in the same era and design as Fukushima. Still, the battle was hard fought and certainly hard won. And even now, there are still questions as to how this victory will play out. Here to talk more about this power struggle is Robbie Leppzer, the film's director and a veteran documentary filmmaker who has chronicled many such social justice grassroots movements. Take a look.
I live 18 miles from the Vermont Yankee nuclear power plant. And if there was ever an accident there, a major release of radioactivity, my community would be affected. So I've been very concerned about what was happening at the Vermont Yankee nuclear power plant for a long time. Vermont Yankee nuclear power plant is located on the Connecticut River in Vermont, but just across the border from New Hampshire, and just a mile or two from the Massachusetts border. So it's right in the southeast corner of Vermont. And when I heard as a filmmaker that the Vermont legislature was the only legislature in the country with authority to make a decision about the future operation of a nuclear power plant, I felt this was an amazing opportunity to make a film to show the process of citizens being involved in a very critical issue that affects all of our lives. In this case, the safety of our communities and the future of energy.
There was, and unfortunately there still is among some people, a view of nuclear power as clean energy, not even a bridge fuel the way that we talk about fracking, but just something that can be lumped in with renewables, right? And did you notice, not obviously amongst the activists, but among just the general public, did you notice that fundamentally shift after Fukushima, even perhaps among people that had been pro Vermont Yankee before, or was it pretty much the same?
The nuclear disaster at Fukushima was definitely a wake-up call for so many people, because it really took this abstraction of this potential threat of massive nuclear radiation release in the future, and it made it very real, because 160,000 Japanese people had to be forcibly evacuated from their homes, and the area around Fukushima is now contaminated, really, most likely indefinitely into the future. It's quite interesting because when I first got involved as a filmmaker, chronicling grassroots social change activists, I was 18 and I was a student at Hampshire College, and I got involved in making a documentary about really the birth of the anti-nuclear power direct action movement, which was at Seabrook, New Hampshire, when 1,414 people got arrested in a mass civil disobedience sit-in at the construction site of the Seabrook, New Hampshire nuclear power plant. And that action really lit a fire all across the country, catalyst, inspiration for direct action civil disobedience sit-ins at nuclear power plants all across the country. This awareness, unfortunately, has faded over the decades, and the nuclear industry has succeeded in their propaganda campaign to try to convince the general public that nuclear power is green and clean, and it is anything but.
Yeah, and I wanted to talk to you about that too, because one of the things that your film does that I think is great as well is highlight the role and the fate of whistleblowers in general, and in this case, Arnie Gunderson, who blew the whistle on dangerous storage of toxic radioactive materials. Talk a little bit about that importance of not only whistleblowers, but whistleblowers who then go on to combat the industry that they are experts on and were once a part of.
Well, when I first met Arnie Gunderson and his wife Maggie Gunderson at a hearing testifying at the Vermont legislature, I knew at that moment that they were going to be key characters in my film, because for me, the idea of having somebody who's actually from the inside of an industry and who really knows how it works, and knows very much the dangers firsthand, and then had an experience that changed their life, and now they're speaking out. Um, they have so much credibility because Arnie and Maggie were in the industry for 20 years, up until the point when they got blacklisted for doing their job, or Arnie doing his job and reporting a safety violation at the nuclear energy services company that he worked at in Connecticut. And then that was in 1990. And then, fast forward ahead to late 2000s, he's living in Burlington, Vermont, and the state legislature of Vermont asks him to be the chairperson of their watchdog committee on Vermont Yankee. And in that process, he uncovers more lies from the company The Associated Press reported a few years ago, and this is actually quoted in the film, that 3/4 of U.S. nuclear power plants are leaking radioactive tritium into the groundwater, and tritium is highly cancerous, and it's a routine emission from nuclear power plants, but in this case, it's actually leaking to the groundwater at most of them. Another problem with nuclear power that nuclear engineer Arnie Gunderson raises in Power Struggle is the issue of the Mark I reactors. This is the same make and model reactor that blew up at Fukushima. And it turns out that there are 21 operating nuclear power plants in the United States, virtually a quarter of the fleet, that are this first generation Mark I's. And basically, the nuclear industry and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission discovered, at least by the mid 80s, that there was a fatal flaw in the design, that basically the containment structure, which is designed to contain the radiation in the event of a major accident like a meltdown, is too small. That in the event of a major accident like a meltdown, the pressures inside the plant will build so it'll blow up, and they're almost guaranteed to blow up. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission said itself an 85% chance. This is in the mid 80s, and Fukushima proved it. All three of the operating nuclear power plants, when Fukushima disaster happened, blew up.
As you noted at the end of the film, spoiler alert, anybody who's watching, even though the plant is closing or closed, there is still the issue of what to do with all that waste. And that's one of the things that I wanted to ask you about, was what's going on with all that waste and what happens now. I mean, it's not like it's not like an oil rig where you can just be like, okay, we've taken our stuff, the oil's still in the ground, we're cool, we're leaving. There's all this nuclear waste, and what's going on with that?
Well, it's interesting because Power Struggle has kind of a double ending. On the one hand, it's a victory, a grassroots victory of democracy in action. The citizens really played, I think, a major role in pushing Vermont Yankee over the edge. I mean, they said they closed because of financial reasons, but it was really because of the public scrutiny that pushed them over the edge. The other side of that ending is the fact that even though the nuclear plant is shut down, it's not making any more nuclear waste. The fact remains that Vermont Yankee and every single nuclear power facility, not only around the United States, but around the world, is in effect a high level nuclear waste dump, because there is no place to put this high level nuclear waste, which is the most toxic substances known to the planet. The plutonium that is one of the radioactive elements that is being left behind is dangerous for 250,000 years. 250,000 years. It's actually unimaginable.
Yeah, and so do you know what specifically is being done about Vermont Yankee in particular?
Well, there is a plan to dismantle the plant, but the main plan is to leave the high level nuclear waste in what are called dry casts on site indefinitely, because there is no place to put them. There is a plan for a high level nuclear waste dump at Yucca Mountain in Nevada on Western Shoshone indigenous land. And there's also another plan to create what's called an interim high level nuclear waste storage site, two plans in New Mexico and West Texas, near indigenous and Latino communities. And this is just, in effect, what activists are calling a parking lot dump, because it's just moving the dry cast to another place, still left totally in the open and vulnerable to terrorist attack. They're not even being put in protected underground berms because the nuclear industry doesn't want to spend the money. And they're also in this situation where they're using dry cast containers with super thin metal steel walls, as opposed to in Europe, there are much thicker walls. And so there's a whole big controversy around how long will these dry casts last before they start leaking. So literally, it's kicking the can down the road, maybe a few decades, and then we're going to be in a whole situation where the high level waste could be leaking through these casks, and now they're out in the open, and there's no way to deal with them.
Yeah, and you pinpoint another powerful issue, which is, of course, that this is predominantly indigenous and black and brown communities that have to deal with this. Is just getting, sent to their communities. And that's on top of the open pit uranium mines that are still leaking, and that the government wants to open more uranium mining to fuel more nuclear power plants, which is of course also on recognized indigenous land. So it's a compounding problem that doesn't seem to have an easy answer. And with that, I wanted to discuss, you've mentioned it a few times now, what makes Vermont special, and of course that's the Public Service Board, and then them having added on to that the state legislature having to offer up a license on top of the federal license. Talk a little bit about what the process looks like for other states. Because it seems ironic that this idea that's very American, that states' rights, states' rights over federal rights, and yet states don't have to give any sort of permit. They just have to accept the federal permit to having a nuclear power plant in their state.
Well, in fact, it is quite rigged, the whole situation, that the federal government has exclusive jurisdiction over nuclear safety matters. However, all states do have authority over regulating non-safety matters. And in particular, with a lot of nuclear power plants shutting down already, and we're seeing that that's going to be rolling out in the near future, states are starting to wake up to the fact that they are going to be living with these high-level nuclear waste dumps indefinitely. So the state of Massachusetts now is actually trying to intervene in the process with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to have intervener status for what happens when the Pilgrim nuclear power plant, which is scheduled to close at the end of May, what happens? Because it's the same issues that they're going to be dealing with at Pilgrim that are affecting people in Vermont, that are affecting people at other nuclear power plants that are closing down in Michigan. And I know in San Onofre, California, or near San Diego, the San Onofre nuclear power plant, there's a big fight going on there about how to protect this nuclear waste that's literally 100 feet from the ocean. I mean, it's ridiculous. And they're not talking about moving it further than that. I mean, it's just outrageous. And so this is what should be on people's radar screens, is that this threat of the nuclear waste is really what we're giving to future generations.
You mentioned that the process is very rigged, and the documentary shows how the NRC just sort of waves away people's concerns when they are finally confronted with community members. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how. Because one of the things that the documentary mentions is that the NRC knew that there was underground piping, and they knew that Vermont Yankee was lying about it, and they were like, sorry, that's just how it works. How can they, I feel kind of naive asking, like, how can they be that way? But how can they actually do that without any sort of legal ramifications? Like, could Vermont, sue the NRC and say, you knew about this, you should have done something about it? Like, how does that work?
Well, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which is the federal agency in charge of monitoring the safety of nuclear power plants, supposedly for the benefit and protection of the U.S. public, is really what's called a captured agency. The nuclear industry, it's been a revolving door, and Governor Peter Shumlin talks about this in Power Struggle, that it's a revolving door between the industry and the regulatory agencies. And so they're really and they're really watered down, the regulations. And Arnie Gunderson talks about his experiences of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission really not being interested in the issues that he raised as a whistleblower. And in fact, engaging in a cover-up back in 1990. And he has documents to prove that. We wanted to get into that into the film, but there just wasn't enough time. So it's really a problem of that we're seeing now all over. I mean, under the Trump administration, agencies working for the industry that they're supposedly regulating is now commonplace. But in fact, with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, this has actually been going on for decades. And frankly, what we've been told by some of the people who are nuclear safety watchdogs and advocates, not only Arnie Gunderson, but people like Dave Lochbaum from the Union of Concerned Scientists, who report that really the only places around the country where the NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, is giving any kind of extra scrutiny is where there's a profound grassroots citizen activism demanding more safety. So you see that at the Indian Point nuclear power plant in New York City. You see that at the Diablo Canyon and San Onofre nuclear power plants in California. You see that in some of the plants in Illinois. There's a strong group in Chicago. And you're starting to see it now with the citizen groups that are rising up in Texas and New Mexico, as well as the longstanding Shoshone resistance in Nevada to oppose those waste dumps in those states.
I just want to hold on something for a moment. 250,000 years. 250,000 years, that's how long nuclear waste remains radioactive. 250,000 years. 1 in 3 Americans live within 50 miles of an operating nuclear reactor. And we have 23 plants that are identical to Fukushima in the US. Just sit with that. And then head over to beyondnuclear.org to get involved in the fight against nuclear energy here in the US. For the complete interview with Robbie, please check out our social media and our podcast, which airs every Friday on Spotify, Stitcher, iTunes, and Libsyn. To get info on how you can watch the film, go to powerstrugglemovie.com. And that will do it for this week's Dose of Dissent. Reminder, before you switch this off, go sign up for our Act Out newsletter. It's the best way to stay up to date on our work. To those who have donated, thank you so much. Please do keep spreading the word about that so that we can keep acting out. From the Devil's Den, good night and act out. And real quick, to keep independent, non-corporatized media like this show going, visit patreon.com/actout.
I can't hear the boots are stomping. Come on, boys, let's get some rocks to throw. I can't stand to hear my father cry anymore. Time we left.